When you're trying to convince someone like, hey, you need to diversify your team if you're a people manager or a leader, well, think about like how diverse is that person's individual network, right? We're all sort of like pocketed and sort of concentrated in these areas. And oftentimes large companies want us to move, to the Bay or to other areas that, we may not have a base, we may not have a network. You very rarely, if ever, stop learning once you get whatever credential you're working toward. Like I've learned more on the job than, what I think I did in my undergrad experience. We just fundamentally believe that like talent is and always has been ubiquitous. It's always been around us and it's been hidden in plain sight. It's that opportunity is not evenly distributed, and that's what we need to focus on.
We are here with Gary Davis, Diversity and Talent Acquisition Lead at Adobe. You all know Adobe, a global leader in digital media, creative and marketing, and document solutions. Gary has over 10 years of experience in inclusive recruitment and talent development in tech, education, and social impact spaces. I'm so happy to get his perspective on today. Gary, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
So could you start by telling us a little bit more about your role and your focus at Adobe and any other prior experiences that led you up there?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been at Adobe now for about 8 or so weeks. It's good because normally when I first start a job, I feel like 8 weeks in, it feels like 2 years. So things are kind of like leveling out perfectly, which I appreciate. But if I were to summarize my role into 3 bullets, it focuses on partnering with our talent acquisition team to build a diverse interview slate. What I mean by that is identifying that there are a number of different people from a number of different backgrounds based on their skill set, based on their expertise that have the right and the responsibility to be a part of our interview pool. So identifying top of funnel resources. So partners, different job boards, different Boolean language to use to sort of locate folks on tools like LinkedIn or maybe even through Google. The second bullet focuses on evaluating opportunities to reduce as much bias in the process as possible. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I think bias is something that is just native to how we think about interviewing and selecting folks for different opportunities. And then the last part is just providing a great deal of coaching. So we're focusing with our interview teams on strategies to be more inclusive in their approach. So maybe it's kind of testing some of their assumptions or encouraging them to do the same. And so when I think about all of that, I've done glimpses of that throughout my entire career. So most immediately prior to Adobe, I worked at the recruiting software company Greenhouse, and we were primarily focused on a portfolio of different features that also helped to be able to reduce bias. So I could see at a high level, like, hey, what does my initial applicant pool look like? What's the number or ratio of different genders, racial backgrounds, disability backgrounds, et cetera? And then how do those ratios shift as folks move through the process? Mm-hmm. And if we recognize that after, the phone screen that we lose 45% of our Asian applicants, for example, like that's actually not work on the candidate. That's work on us, right? Like that's an opportunity for us to go back and see what are the questions that we're posing? How are we documenting and the evidence that we're capturing? So it's really shifting people's mindsets around there are actually lots of different things that you can do that are within your wheelhouse and power to make your process fair and more equitable. But before that, I'm a nonprofit turned tech person. So I've been doing a lot of work around college access, workforce development, and really just kind of wanted to extend that out as far as I could to focus on really rewiring how we think about interviewing and hiring and talent selection. So I would say that those are my main career objectives and goals.
So right now, there's so much talk around DEI initiatives and what it looks like to build a strong roadmap for companies, why it matters, which is amazing to see the growth in the conversation, but kind of brings out twofold. There's some companies that are scrambling to come up with a strong DEI program, and it almost comes off as a siloed initiatives. And there's other companies that have it fully embedded within their culture. Could you get to the heart of where we're currently at in 2022 with DEI and hiring? What do companies really need to know and have, whether that's programs or mindsets, and what do prospective candidates really want to see?
Yeah. So I love this question. And there's so many different layers to it. So I'm glad we're able to kind of get this one up first. I think that the current state, many of us are sold on the what, right? Like we understand that there's opportunities to make our organizations more diverse. And when I say diversity, I mean like literally numerical representation based on different demographics and backgrounds. That said, I think a lot of us are confused on the how. Like, I think there's this component of us that, like, obviously want to do it legally, right? As we all should. So, listeners, make sure everything you're doing from a DI perspective is legal and clear with your legal team. But I also think there's a question around ethically, like, how do we approach this work? How do we operationalize it? How do we scale it? It can't necessarily rely on, one particular source or stream where candidates actually flow from. So I hear a lot of talk around like wanting to partner with historically Black colleges and universities, for example, which I think is, most important, right? I think that's something that we have to get into the habit of actually doing more regularly. But I think on the other side, there's a question of like, well, why are we just now doing these things? What has sort of stalled us from wanting to be more intentional about diversifying our pipelines, as well as redressing how we think about interviewing candidates equitably and fairly? So to your point, I think there is a mindset shift that needs to happen. I think we just fundamentally need to agree that diversity is a value and bonus add. I'm not going to necessarily go into the quoting of the different studies from McKinsey that talk about this, but I think again, like every DEI webinar I'm on references that in some way, shape, or form. And so I think people are aware that it's a value add, but on the flip side, it's challenging, I think, to kind of enforce someone to be more equitable in their work world when they're not necessarily doing that in their personal life. And so when you're trying to convince someone like, hey, you need to diversify your team if you're a people manager or a leader, well, think about like how diverse is that person's individual network, right? If this is not necessarily like a native superpower they have, so to speak, it's not necessarily going to be something that translates at work, especially since like the accountability is so limited in a lot of different ways. So I feel like present state, we're trying to really scramble, like how do we actually action or connect thought to action between the things that we want? How do we actually evaluate how our process needs to evolve over time? And so I see a lot of folks that will say, again, we partner with HBCUs, other minority serving institutions, et cetera, but we are not necessarily evolving in how we think about interviewing candidates. There's a strong fidelity to culture, which I think is important, but I think on the other side of that, it's, well, our culture, our process brought us the great people that work here, sure, but we also know that there's some really palpable data around like things like name. So if my name is associated with a traditionally more African American name, that will influence whether or not I actually get an interview, or based on my skin complexion, that will also influence my experience in the process, or gender, or what have you. So I think it's important that we understand like all of these different things are at play. We can't necessarily suspend these when we're talking to candidates or building processes for candidates. And to your other question with what candidates are expecting, everything I'm reading now suggests that everyone wants a diverse organization. They want a diverse team. They want to ask questions about sort of what are the priorities. And I think on the other side, they want to know like, hey, I can actually see myself here. I'm going to give the listeners a tip. So we have this thing, it's called a whisper network where, as a Black man, like I will oftentimes reach out to other Black men at companies I'm looking at just to gauge like, hey, what does your experience look like? What does advancement look like in this particular setting? Like, do you feel like you're being treated fairly in this environment? And that flows both ways. People contact me all the time about those types of opportunities and questions. And so I think candidates are rightfully so more targeted in their expectations of how inclusive an organization needs to be, as well as how diverse it needs to be. And rightfully so, I don't think that they're wavering on that. And so I think it's a balance where the consumer, meaning potential candidates, want to see a more diverse setting. I think employers in some cases are kind of scrambling on how to get there. But at some point, I think employers need to recognize that it is, and probably always has been, a buyer's market, meaning that the candidates are going to fill the roles. And so we need to be able to meet their expectations and demands and just recognize it's a value add for all of us.
Carries so much wisdom built in that perspective. I very much appreciate that. And one thing I like to highlight that you point out is everybody does know the what, but it is the how that can be difficult, and even the why for some people where it might not be native to their self. So being able to educate people on that, getting everyone on the same page, I very much appreciate your advice on that. Now, you use a data-driven and location strategy approach to recruit. Could you expand on this for us? What does that really look like, and how does that affect your hiring?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the things I think COVID did is that it demonstrated for several companies, not all, but we can virtually work anywhere, right? Like literally, we can be distributed across the United States or across the world, still be able to get our jobs done, and center around just to be personally productive and effective. When I think about looking at labor market data, when I think about the tech environment, like that's primarily concentrated on the coast. So New York, Boston, San Francisco Bay Area. When I think about where Black people or people of color broadly working in tech or even women, they're not necessarily we don't always necessarily live in these particular areas. And if we do, those ratios are smaller and smaller. And so one of the things that I've been super passionate about is how do we actually establish like realistic targets by geographical market? So I use tools like the United States Census data. So obviously we just had a census run a couple years ago. We can see what these estimates look like by geography or zip code. And on the other side of that, I also want to drill down a little bit further to see like, hey, well, what percentage of the tech workforce in the DC region where I live, for example, what exactly does that look like? How many of those folks or percentages identify as Black? If that number is higher than what we would typically see in Silicon Valley, like maybe we need to pivot and focus on hiring people directly where they are. When I think about the southeastern region of the United States, like there's obviously a larger population of Black talent, for example. So I think about Atlanta, I think about St. Louis, I think about Louisiana. We're all sort of like pocketed and sort of concentrated in these areas. And oftentimes large companies want us to move, to the Bay or to other areas that, we may not have a base, we may not have a network. And so I think it's important that when folks are in the process of trying to establish diversity or representation targets, they sort of localize that, understand exactly where does the diversity thrive, where exactly does it live, and you go after them. You don't necessarily expect for you to come to you. And so we've been working on designing heat maps where we can see at a high level what are the states that have greater racial diversity in the tech workforce, what are the metropolitan regions that have that too. And then from there, localizing our strategy. So it could mean that we are, using a tool like LinkedIn Recruiter, adding these sort of target cities into the mix. Could also mean that we're partnering with like local organizations in that space, because again, we're using these markers to kind of determine like, hey, this person is a best guesstimate, potentially identifies as a woman, potentially identifies as a woman of color, so on and so forth. And so I think it's important that folks just confer any available labor analytics that are out there to help you sort of design a more data-driven strategy. If you're only going to try to pull folks or hire folks in Austin, for example, or in San Francisco, but you want a really, really diverse organization across lines of race, probably not going to happen. But if you were to look at Atlanta, if you were to look in DC or Baltimore or Chicago, there are definitely other places out there that can actually make the job easier for you. It doesn't need to be as challenging.
I think that's a great piece of advice, Gary, and I don't think we hear that too often. And I think that helps provide some tangibility to what people can do to expand their reach, because it is kind of a natural default to go, okay, everybody in New York or everybody right in Cali. So I think that's an awesome piece of advice. Now, what does it look like to build an inclusive hiring process?
Great question. I don't think most of us even really know the answer to it, because I think our processes are full of so much bias. But I think the first part is recognizing that most of our hiring processes are not inclusive. Like that's step one. You have to kind of like base camp, recognize there's work to be done. I think about this across the entire arc of the actual hiring process. So from when we write our job descriptions, what language are we including? Folks have talked about kind of anecdotally the differences in who applies based on gender. I've actually seen research that indicates that men and women equally almost don't apply for jobs when they feel like they don't meet the qualifications because they don't want to waste their time, right? And so I think it's important that we not treat these job descriptions as these sort of like laundry lists of all the things that we want. I mean, I've read job descriptions where I'm like, well, this is like a C-suite level role, but you're coding it or leveling it as a program manager. So like, what else, what are the other people around here doing in addition? I always recommend folks sort of start with the outcomes that you want the person to hit. It's actually not about sort of things like pedigree. So I know we talk a lot about, bachelor's degree required, for example. Well, I have a bachelor's degree in sociology. It doesn't necessarily relate directly to the work that I'm doing, nor the work that I've done in the past. And I think particularly in a tech setting, you very rarely, if ever, stop learning once you get whatever credential you're working toward. Like I've learned more on the job than, what I think I did in my undergrad experience. And so I think it's, in addition to just the language that we include, the formatting, we're focusing on the outcomes, we're focusing on really inclusive language. So there are tools out there that will literally review your job descriptions for you, give you recommendations, almost in the format of something like a Grammarly, what's kind of like a spell check. There are free tools that will tell you like, hey, the language is coded this way. You may want to sort of shift it so to be a bit more neutral. I think when we're doing the actual interviewing or sort of like pre-screen, like we do use a lot of pre-qualifiers. So we'll look at, again, institution that you attended or maybe industry that you worked in. And we make assumptions about that. We rely, I think, on the admissions folks from your undergrad experience or recruiters from your previous experience to sort of use as a proxy for your intelligence. But, just because you go to Ivy League institution doesn't make you the most intelligent person in the world, right? We just fundamentally believe that like talent is and always has been ubiquitous. It's always been around us and it's been hidden in plain sight. It's that opportunity is not evenly distributed. And that's what we need to focus on. But I think when we're doing those pre-screens, the questions that we're posing, the assumptions that we're making, we say that recruiters take about 6 seconds to look at your resume to make a judgment about you. And then even in the actual interview, it's even shorter than that. So I think we have to get more conscientious about the types of questions that we're posing, the type of evidence that we're capturing, and have some type of system to really hold us accountable. So I mentioned earlier at Greenhouse, we could see all anonymized and all aggregated, but we can see like, hey, what does the top of funnel look like? What did our initial applicant pool look like? And if we notice that certain populations are falling off, what can we do differently, right? Like I almost treated those reports as you would the census. So what does the census do? It gives you insight into where you need to allocate resources, funding, attention. And I think having some type of mechanism to sort of hold your own team accountable makes the process more inclusive because again, it's an ongoing iterative thing. It's never going to be like 100% inclusive because there's so many different identities out there. But I think it's important that we get into the habit of being curious and critical about how we presently hire. Pay attention to the audiences that seem to advance at faster or higher rates. Think about people that are referred, sort of the bonus add that they get for that, but then also recognizing that a lot of our networks are filled with people that look like us. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think there's so many different things I think that can be done, but I think the biggest piece is having some type of mechanism for accountability.
I appreciate that. And one thing I do want to highlight that you had mentioned is it's not just about pedigree. And I do understand this idea of you kind of vet someone initially for that initial intellect, maybe where they went, what experiences they have. But then there also comes this balance between intellect and passion. So you might have someone that went to an Ivy League school and has the great intellect. You might have someone else that maybe doesn't have as many of those type of experiences, but is forward as a community leader within their niche, or someone that is in competitions or tournaments or very forward and active in what they want to do. It just kind of looks different. So I do appreciate that perspective a lot.
I fundamentally agree. I think I don't think we're ever going to be able to shift people's perceptions about the prestige that comes with an Ivy League degree, for example. But, I have seen some people that will redact that information from the resume altogether as a part of sort of not making sure that people feel like they can use that information to make a judgment about a person. So, we've experimented with like resume anonymization in the past. There's like a mixed bag of research on that. But I think to the greatest extent possible that we can kind of like redact information that's going to prejudice someone in either way or direction. I think there's a benefit there because again, I don't think we're going to be able to shift those perceptions, not in the short run.
Absolutely. And now last question for you, Gary. At Solvable, we're all about what drives purpose and meaning for people at work. So I'd love to know what drives purpose and meaning for you.
What drives purpose and meaning for me is really impact. And I think having started in the nonprofit world where working with young children and getting them ready for college access, the thought process always was like, well, if I'm doing this job well, one day these students are going to be my colleagues. Or I may report to them at some point. And so it's important for me to kind of leave a lasting impact that like moves the needle. I think as I get older, I'm trying to not kind of be like a savior, so to speak. So I try to recognize like what's actually within my remit and wheelhouse that I can actually influence and control. But I would say that being able to sort of connect a person to an opportunity to disrupt or to dismantle a process or a system that otherwise would have kept them out of it. And making sure that people understand, like, listen, you have every right to be here. I don't actually even believe in imposter syndrome anymore. So really trying to challenge people's understanding and interpretations of that and recognize that, like, hey, you have just as much credibility as the next person and that you have an obligation to show up, show out, and be as authentic as possible.
There you have it, everyone. The hiring equity gladiator, as on his LinkedIn. Gary, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you all for listening to Architects of Contemporary Hiring.
Awesome. Thank you all, everyone.